The heat hit Sarah Mitchell the moment she stepped out of her truck. It was the kind of heat that made breathing feel like work, the kind that sucked moisture from everything it touched. She stood in the gravel parking lot of the small cabin she had rented and looked out at the forest stretching before her. The trees were green, but they looked tired. The grass beneath them was brown and brittle. Everything seemed to be waiting for something to happen. Sarah had driven for 2 days to reach this place. She had come from Seattle, where the summer was warm but manageable. Here in Montana, the summer was different. It was angry. The news had been full of warnings about fires and drought. Every gas station she stopped at had signs about fire danger. Every radio station talked about the dry conditions. But Sarah needed to be here. Her job required it. She was a wildlife photographer. For the past 6 years, she had traveled to different places, taking pictures of animals and nature. Her latest assignment was to document how the drought was affecting wildlife in the mountain forests. Her editor wanted powerful images, the kind that would make people pay attention to climate change. Sarah had 3 weeks to get those images. The cabin was small and simple. 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom that smelled like pine cleaner. The windows faced the forest, and Sarah could see the mountains in the distance. She unpacked her cameras, her lenses, and her hiking gear. Tomorrow morning, she would start exploring the trails. Tonight, she would rest and plan her routes. As the sun began to set, Sarah sat on the cabin's small porch and studied her map. She had marked several trails that looked promising. The Forest Service website had mentioned that elk and deer were moving to lower elevations looking for water. There was a creek bed about 5 miles into the forest where animals might gather. That would be her first location. She didn't notice the truck that drove slowly past her cabin. She didn't see the man behind the wheel who glanced at her out-of-state license plates and shook his head. Jake Thornton had lived in this valley his entire life. His family had owned the same ranch for 4 generations. He knew every road, every trail, every creek, and every dangerous spot in these mountains. He also knew when outsiders arrived, especially during fire season, and he knew that most of them didn't understand how serious things were. Jake was 35 years old. He had the kind of body that came from real work, not from a gym. His hands were calloused and scarred. His face was weathered from years under the sun. He wore boots that had been repaired multiple times and a hat that had seen better days. He didn't care much about appearances. He cared about his cattle, his land, and keeping his family's ranch alive. He was also a volunteer firefighter. He had been since he was 18. Every summer, he and the other volunteers trained and prepared for fires. Every summer, they hoped the fires wouldn't come. But this summer was different. This summer, everyone knew the fires would come. It was just a matter of when. Jake drove back to his ranch as the sky turned orange and purple. His dog, a border collie named Scout, greeted him at the door. Jake fed the dog, checked on his cattle, and then sat down at his kitchen table with a bottle of beer and a stack of bills. The ranch wasn't doing well. The drought had killed his hay crop. He had to buy feed for his cattle, and feed was expensive. His bank account was low. His truck needed repairs. Everything seemed to be falling apart at the same time. His phone buzzed. It was a message from the volunteer fire department. Another reminder about the extreme fire danger. Another request for volunteers to be on standby. Jake finished his beer and went to bed early. He would need his energy tomorrow. Sarah woke before dawn. She loaded her camera gear into her backpack and filled her water bottles. The air was already warm. She drove to the trailhead she had marked on her map and started hiking as the sun came up. The forest was beautiful but unsettling. Everything was too quiet. She was used to hearing birds and insects, but here the silence was heavy. The only sound was her boots on the dry earth. After an hour of hiking, she reached the creek bed she had read about. It was completely dry. Not even a trickle of water remained. The rocks at the bottom were covered in dust, but there were animal tracks everywhere. Deer tracks, elk tracks, and what might have been bear tracks. Sarah set up her camera and waited. Photography required patience. Sometimes she waited for hours to get a single good shot. She didn't mind. She had always been comfortable with silence. Around noon, a small group of deer appeared. They moved carefully, nervously. They sniffed the dry creek bed looking for water that wasn't there. Sarah began taking pictures. The light was perfect. The images would be powerful. This was exactly what her editor wanted. She was so focused on her work that she didn't notice the truck parked at the trailhead when she returned. But when she reached her vehicle, she found a note under her windshield wiper. The note said, "This area is dangerous. Fire risk is extreme. Please stay on marked trails only and avoid hiking during afternoon heat. Local fire department." Sarah crumpled the note and tossed it in her truck. She was being careful. She had water. She knew what she was doing. She had hiked in difficult conditions before. Over the next few days, Sarah explored different areas. She photographed elk with ribs showing through their skin. She captured images of a dried-up pond with dead fish. She documented trees that were losing their needles early because of stress. The pictures were good, but she needed more. She needed something that would really make people feel the urgency of the situation. She kept finding notes on her truck. They were always the same, polite but firm warnings about fire danger. It started to annoy her. She was an adult. She could make her own decisions. On the 5th day, she finally saw who was leaving the notes. She had just returned from a morning hike when a truck pulled up next to hers. A man got out. He was tall and solid, wearing work clothes and boots. He looked at her for a moment, then walked over. "You're the photographer," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Sarah replied. "And you're the person leaving notes on my truck." "That's right. I'm Jake Thornton. I'm with the volunteer fire department, and I'm asking you to be more careful about where you're hiking." "I'm being careful," Sarah said. She could feel herself getting defensive. "I check the weather. I carry water. I stay aware of my surroundings." "That's good," Jake said. "But you're also hiking in areas that could trap you if a fire starts. Do you know how fast a fire can move in these conditions?" "I can handle myself," Sarah said. Jake looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were gray and direct. People always think they can handle themselves. That's usually when things go wrong. "I appreciate your concern," Sarah said. "But I have a job to do. I'm here to document what's happening to this forest and the animals in it." "That's important work." "I'm not saying it isn't important," Jake replied. "I'm saying it won't matter if you're dead." The conversation ended there. Jake got back in his truck and drove away. Sarah stood in the parking lot, angry and frustrated. Who did he think he was? She had been doing this job for years. She had hiked in rainforests and deserts. She had photographed animals in Africa and South America. She didn't need some rancher telling her how to do her job. But that night, lying in bed in her small cabin, Sarah thought about what Jake had said. She thought about how quiet the forest was, how dry everything looked, how nervous the animals seemed. Maybe she was being too confident. Maybe she should be more careful. The next morning, she checked the Forest Service website. Several trails had been closed overnight due to increased fire danger. The wind was picking up and the humidity was dropping. These were the conditions that led to fires. Sarah looked at her map. The closed trails included some of the areas she wanted to explore. But there were still other places she could go. Places that weren't officially closed but were marked as high risk. She'd been taking good pictures, but she needed something extraordinary. Something that would make her entire trip worthwhile. She decided to scout one more location, a ridge that overlooked a valley where elk had been spotted. It was farther from the main trails but not technically closed. She would go early in the morning when it was cooler. She would be quick and careful. She would get her shots and leave before the heat of the day. Jake saw Sarah's truck at the trailhead when he drove past at dawn. He recognized it immediately. He pulled over and sat there for a moment, debating with himself. It wasn't his job to babysit tourists. He had his own work to do, his own problems to deal with. But something made him write down the time and location in his notebook, just in case the day grew hotter. By 10 in the morning, the temperature was already above 90 degrees. The wind had picked up, blowing from the west. Jake was fixing a fence on his property when he saw the smoke, just a thin line on the horizon at first, then another. Then another. His phone rang. It was the fire department. Lightning strikes had started 3 small fires in the national forest. They were sending crews out immediately. All volunteers were being called in. Jake dropped his tools and ran to his truck. Scout jumped in beside him. As Jake drove toward town, he thought about the photographer. He thought about her truck at that trailhead. He tried to remember exactly where she had parked. Sarah had gotten her shots. Sarah's alarm went off at 4 in the morning. She woke up feeling groggy but determined. Outside her window, the world was still dark. She made coffee, filled her water bottles, and checked her camera equipment one more time. Everything was ready. By the time she reached the trailhead, the sky was beginning to lighten. The air was cool, the coolest it had been in weeks. This was the best time to hike before the heat built up. Sarah locked her truck and started down the trail. She moved quickly, her boots making soft sounds on the dusty path. The trail was rougher than she expected. It hadn't been maintained well, and fallen branches blocked the path in several places. Sarah had to climb over logs and push through brush. It took her longer than planned to reach the area she wanted. By the time she found the creek bed, the sun was fully up and the temperature was already rising. But the location was perfect. The creek had once been wide and strong, but now it was just a trickle. And standing near the water were a family of elk. A large bull, 2 females, and 3 young calves. They were drinking from the small stream, their heads down, completely focused on the precious water. Sarah moved slowly and quietly. She found a spot behind some rocks where she could set up her camera without disturbing the animals. The light was golden and beautiful. The elk looked thin but dignified. This was the image she had been looking for. This was what would make people understand what was happening. She took picture after picture. Different angles, different exposures. She wanted options. She wanted the perfect shot. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice the smoke at first. It was Scout who noticed it miles away at Jake's ranch. Jake had just finished feeding his cattle when Scout started barking. The dog was staring toward the western ridge, his body tense. Jake looked where the dog was looking and felt his stomach drop. Smoke. A new column of smoke much closer than the fires from yesterday. This one was on the western ridge, maybe 5 miles from his property. His phone rang before he could even process what he was seeing. It was the fire captain. Lightning had struck again during the night. A new fire had started on the western ridge. The wind was already pushing it east. They needed all volunteers immediately. Jake grabbed his gear and jumped in his truck. As he drove toward the fire station, his mind was racing. The western ridge. That was close to several trailheads. That was close to where he had seen the photographer's truck before. He tried to remember exactly where she had parked that first morning. Was it near the western ridge area? He couldn't be sure. When Jake reached the fire station, chaos greeted him. Trucks were being loaded with equipment. Firefighters were pulling on their gear. The captain was shouting orders. The fire on the western ridge was growing faster than expected. The wind was pushing it toward populated areas. They needed to establish fire breaks immediately. Jake was assigned to a crew that would create a fire break on the eastern edge of the fire. It was dangerous work. They would be cutting trees and clearing brush right in the path of the advancing flames. But it was necessary. If they could create a wide enough break, the fire might stop when it ran out of fuel. As Jake drove with his crew toward their assignment, he kept watching the smoke. It was thick and dark, which meant the fire was burning hot and fast. The wind was steady and strong. These were the worst conditions. These were the conditions where fires became unstoppable. Sarah was still photographing the elk when she noticed the smoke. At first, she thought it was the same smoke she had seen yesterday, just carried on the wind. But then she realized it was different. This smoke was darker and closer, much closer. She lowered her camera and turned toward the west. Her heart started beating faster. The smoke was coming from the direction she needed to go to reach her truck. The smoke was between her and safety. The elk noticed the smoke too. Suddenly alert, they raised their heads and sniffed the air. Then, without warning, they bolted. All of them running together away from the smoke. Sarah watched them disappear into the trees and felt very alone. She needed to move. Now. She quickly packed her camera gear and started back down the trail. But after just a few minutes, she realized something was wrong. The smoke was getting thicker, not thinner. The wind was blowing it directly toward her. And worst of all, she could see flames now, orange and red, visible through the trees. The fire wasn't 5 miles away anymore. It was less than a mile. And it was moving fast. Sarah started running. Her backpack bounced heavily against her shoulders. Branches scratched her arms and face. She stumbled twice but caught herself both times. Her lungs were burning, both from exertion and from the smoke. The air was getting harder to breathe. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the phone. A woman's voice answered immediately. 911, what's your emergency? I'm trapped by a fire, Sarah gasped. I'm in the national forest near the western ridge. The fire is coming toward me. I can't get to my truck. Where exactly are you? The dispatcher asked. Her voice was calm and professional. Can you give me landmarks? Sarah tried to describe her location, but panic was making it hard to think clearly. She mentioned the creek bed, the elk, the trail. The dispatcher was typing rapidly, asking questions, trying to pinpoint Sarah's exact position. I'm connecting you with our fire coordinator, the dispatcher said. Stay on the line. Don't hang up. Sarah kept walking as fast as she could while waiting. The smoke was getting thicker. Her eyes were watering. She pulled her shirt up over her nose and mouth, trying to filter the air. It didn't help much. A male voice came on the line. This is Fire Coordinator Jensen. I need you to stay calm and listen carefully.
Can you see the fire?
Yes, Sarah said. Her voice was hoarse. It's behind me, maybe half a mile. Which direction are you walking? East, toward where I parked. But the smoke is so thick I can barely see. There was a pause. Sarah could hear voices in the background, people talking urgently. Then Jensen came back on. Listen to me carefully. The fire is moving east with the wind. You're walking directly into its path. You need to change direction. Head south if you can. Sarah felt a wave of despair. South meant going deeper into the forest. South meant moving away from her truck, away from any road. But Jensen was right. She could feel the heat now, even through the smoke. The fire was close and getting closer. I'm changing direction, she told Jensen. Her voice cracked. But I don't know this area. I don't know where to go. We have a team nearby, Jensen said. They're going to try to reach you. But you need to keep moving. Find any clearing you can. Avoid heavy brush. Do you have water? 2 bottles, Sarah said. Good, save it. Keep your phone on so we can track your location. Someone will get to you. Sarah changed direction, pushing through the brush toward the south. Every minute, the smoke got worse. She started coughing. Her eyes were burning. She couldn't see more than a few feet in front of her. Several times she walked into trees or tripped over logs she couldn't see. Her phone stayed pressed to her ear like a lifeline. At the fire station, Jake was about to leave with his crew when Jensen called him over. The coordinator's face was grim. We have someone trapped on the western side, Jensen said. A hiker. She's on foot, moving south, but the fire is going to overtake her position in less than 30 minutes. The helicopter can't fly in this smoke. The nearest engine company is 40 minutes out. Where exactly is she? Jake asked. Jensen showed him a map on his computer screen. A red dot pulsed, showing the hiker's phone location. Jake felt ice in his stomach. He knew that area. It was rough terrain, full of ravines and thick brush. It was the kind of place where someone could easily get lost or injured. I can get there faster, Jake said. My ranch borders that area. I know the back roads. Jensen shook his head. You can't go in there alone. It's against protocol. We need to wait for... In 30 minutes she'll be dead, Jake interrupted. He was already moving toward his truck. I'm going. You can write me up later. Jake, wait. Jensen started, but Jake was already gone. Scout jumped into the truck beside him. Jake threw the vehicle into gear and roared out of the parking lot. He knew he was breaking rules. He knew he could get in serious trouble. But none of that mattered. Someone was going to die if he didn't try to help. He took the back road that led to his ranch, then turned onto a rough 4-wheel drive trail that most people didn't even know existed. The trail wound through the forest, climbing over rough terrain. Jake pushed the truck as fast as he dared. Branches scraped the sides. Rocks clanged against the undercarriage. Scout braced himself against the dashboard. Jake's phone rang. It was Jensen. Jake, I have the hiker on the line. I'm going to patch her through to you. A moment later, Sarah's voice came through. She sounded terrified. Hello, who is this? My name is Jake Thornton, Jake said, keeping his voice calm. I'm a volunteer firefighter and I'm coming to get you. I need you to stay on the line with me. Can you do that? Yes, Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Good. I need you to keep moving south, away from the fire. I'm going to reach you, but I need you to stay moving and stay calm. I can't see anything, Sarah said. The smoke is too thick. I keep running into things and that's okay. Just keep moving. Feel your way if you have to. The important thing is to keep putting distance between you and the fire. The rock formation was smaller than Jake had remembered. It was a cluster of large boulders with a shallow depression behind them, barely big enough for 2 people and a dog. Jake dropped to his knees and started clearing away dry brush and pine needles from the depression. Every bit of fuel he could remove was one less thing that could burn them. Sarah stood frozen, watching the orange glow through the smoke. The roar of the fire was getting louder. It sounded alive, hungry. She could feel the heat on her skin even though the flames weren't visible yet. "Help me," Jake said sharply. The command broke through Sarah's paralysis. She dropped down beside him and started pulling away dead branches and leaves. Her hands were shaking badly. Jake worked with swift efficiency. He had practiced this in training, but he had never thought he would actually need to do it. The fire shelters were made of aluminum foil-like material bonded to fiberglass. They were designed to reflect radiant heat and protect against direct flames. In theory, they could keep people alive even in the middle of a fire. In theory. "Listen carefully," Jake said as he worked. "When I tell you we're going to get into this depression, we'll cover ourselves with these shelters. Scout will be between us. You need to keep your face down, close to the ground. The air there will be cooler. Keep the shelter tucked under your body so the wind doesn't lift it." "How long?" Sarah asked. Her voice was barely audible. "However long it takes for the fire to pass," Jake said. "Could be 10 minutes. Could be an hour. I don't know." He pulled out the bottles of water from his pack. He soaked 2 shirts with water and handed one to Sarah. "Wrap this around your face. It'll help with the smoke." Sarah took the wet shirt with trembling hands. She looked at Jake, really looked at him for the first time. His face was dirty with soot and sweat, but his eyes were steady. He wasn't panicking. He was focused. That focus was the only thing keeping her from completely falling apart. "Why did you come?" she asked suddenly. "You could have stayed safe." "Why did you risk your life for me?" Jake paused in his preparations. He looked at her for a moment. "Because that's what you do," he said simply. "When someone needs help, you help them. That's all there is to it." Before Sarah could respond, the wind suddenly changed. It gusted hard, bringing with it a wave of heat so intense that both of them gasped. Through the smoke, they could now see the flames clearly. A wall of orange and red, taller than trees, racing toward them. "Now," Jake shouted. "Get down now." They dropped into the depression. Scout squeezed between them, whimpering but obedient. Jake unfolded the fire shelters, the silver material crackling as he spread it over them. Sarah helped him, her movements clumsy with fear. They tucked the edges under their bodies, creating a small protected space. "Stay down," Jake said. His face was inches from hers in the confined space. "No matter what happens, no matter what you hear or feel, stay down. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded. Then the fire hit. The sound was unbelievable. It was like being inside a jet engine. The roar was so loud that Sarah couldn't hear her own screams. The heat came through the shelter in waves. It felt like being inside an oven. Sarah pressed her face against the ground, gasping for air. The dirt against her cheek was hot. The fire shelter rattled and shook. The wind tried to rip it away. Jake spread his body over Sarah and Scout, using his weight to keep the shelter in place. His back was exposed to the heat. Sarah could feel him tense up, could feel him struggling to stay still. She realized with horror that he was being burned. His back and arms were taking the worst of the heat, and he wasn't moving. He was keeping himself between her and the fire. Time stopped meaning anything. There was only heat and sound and pain. Sarah's lungs felt like they were on fire. Every breath was agony. The wet cloth over her face had dried within seconds and was now uncomfortably hot. She wanted to move, wanted to get up and run, but Jake's body held her down. Scout was whimpering continuously. Sarah could feel the dog shaking against her. She reached out in the darkness under the shelter and found the dog's head. She held it, stroking Scout's fur, trying to comfort the animal even as she herself was terrified. Jake didn't make a sound, but Sarah could feel him trembling. She could feel the tension in his body as he fought to stay in position. His back had to be burning. The heat was incredible even where she was, protected beneath him. What must it be like for him? "Jake," she tried to say, but her throat was too dry. No sound came out. The minutes stretched impossibly long. Sarah started to think it would never end. She started to think they would die here, slowly cooked alive under this silver shelter. Her mind began to drift. She thought about her parents, about the brother she had lost to fire so many years ago. She thought about all the pictures she would never take, all the places she would never see. Then she felt Jake shift slightly above her. His hand found hers in the darkness. He squeezed her fingers. That squeeze said everything. It said, "Hang on, stay with me, we're going to make it." Sarah squeezed back, holding onto his hand like it was the only real thing left in the world. Gradually, impossibly, the sound began to change. The roar became less intense. The heat, while still terrible, was no longer quite as overwhelming. The fire was passing. It was moving on, leaving them behind. Jake didn't move for several more minutes. He wanted to be absolutely sure. Finally, carefully, he lifted one edge of the shelter. Smoke poured in, but it was gray smoke now, not the black smoke of an active fire. He looked around, assessing. The world had changed. Everything was black. The trees that had surrounded them were now charred poles. The ground was covered in ash. Small flames still burned here and there, but the main fire had moved on. They had survived. Jake tried to sit up and gasped in pain. His entire back felt like it was on fire. He looked down at Sarah. Her face was black with soot, her hair was singed, but she was alive. Scout was panting heavily but seemed okay. "Can you move?" Jake asked. His voice was hoarse. Sarah tried to speak but could only cough. She nodded instead. With Jake's help, she crawled out from under the shelter. When she stood up, her legs nearly gave out. Jake caught her with one arm, then winced at the movement. That's when Sarah saw his back. His shirt had burned away in places. Underneath, his skin was red and blistered. Some areas looked worse than red. They looked white and charred. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. "Jake, you're back." "I know," Jake said. He was trying to stay calm, but she could see the pain in his eyes. "We need to move. The fire is still spreading. We need to get to a safe area." "You need a hospital," Sarah said. "First, we need to be somewhere a helicopter can land," Jake replied. He pulled out his radio. It had melted partially, but it still worked. "Jensen, this is Thornton. We survived. We're mobile. What's our best route out?" Jensen's voice came back, crackling with static and emotion. "Jake, thank God I have a helicopter standing by. There's a clearing about a quarter-mile northeast of your position. Can you make it there?" Jake looked at Sarah. She was barely standing. He was injured. Scout was exhausted. A quarter-mile through burned terrain. It might as well have been a marathon. "We'll make it," Jake said into the radio. They started walking. Every step was difficult. The ground was hot through their boots. Ash swirled around them, making it hard to breathe. Sarah had to stop every few minutes to cough. Jake moved stiffly, trying not to move his back too much. Scout stayed close, as if sensing they both needed him. Sarah tried to help Jake, tried to support him, but he shook his head. "I'm okay," he said. "Just keep moving." But he wasn't okay. Sarah could see him getting paler. She could see sweat pouring down his face, despite the fact that he must be dehydrated. Burns this severe caused shock. She knew that much. She had done a story once about burn victims. She knew that Jake needed medical attention immediately. "Why did you do it?" she asked as they walked. She needed to keep him talking, needed to keep him conscious. "Why did you put yourself over me like that?" Jake was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My grandfather was a firefighter. When I was a kid, he told me something. He said that the measure of a person isn't what they do when things are easy. It's what they do when everything is burning down around them. That's when you find out what you're really made of." "You're made of something pretty amazing," Sarah said softly. Jake tried to smile, but it came out as more of a grimace. "Ask me that when we're out of here." The clearing appeared through the smoke. It was a small meadow, blackened but open, and sitting in the middle of it, rotors already spinning, was a helicopter. 2 paramedics jumped out and ran toward them. "We've got you," one of them said, taking Sarah's arm. "You're safe now." The other paramedic took one look at Jake's back and immediately called to the helicopter. "We need burn transport, stat." Everything happened quickly after that. The paramedics wrapped Jake's burns in sterile dressings. They put an oxygen mask on Sarah's face. They loaded all 3 of them into the helicopter. Scout sat on Sarah's lap, shaking but quiet. As the helicopter lifted off, Sarah looked out the window. The forest below was destroyed. Miles and miles of blackened earth and skeletal trees. In the distance, she could still see the fire burning, a line of orange against the smoke. It looked small from up here, almost insignificant, but she knew how powerful it was. She had felt its heat. She had heard its roar. The first time Sarah saw Jake after the fire, he was lying face down on a hospital bed in the ICU. Tubes and wires connected him to various machines. His back was covered in white bandages. A nurse was checking his vitals when Sarah was finally allowed in. 5 minutes, the nurse said gently. "He's still sedated, but you can talk to him. Some patients can hear even when they can't respond." Sarah approached the bed slowly. Up close, Jake looked smaller than she remembered. Vulnerable. His face was turned to the side, and she could see dark circles under his eyes. His hands resting on the white sheets were also bandaged. "Jake," she said softly. "It's Sarah. I just wanted you to know. I wanted to say thank you. You saved my life. You didn't have to do what you did, but you did it anyway." Her voice broke. "I'm so sorry this happened to you." "I'm so sorry." Jake didn't respond. The machines beeped steadily. Sarah reached out and gently touched his shoulder, one of the few places that wasn't bandaged. Then the nurse was there, indicating that her time was up. Sarah left the ICU and found a waiting room. She had been given clean clothes from the hospital donation bin. She had been discharged but had nowhere to go, so she just stayed. Scout was with a hospital volunteer downstairs, since animals weren't allowed in most of the hospital. Sarah had made sure the dog was fed and comfortable. Over the next few days, Sarah learned more about Jake than she had before. Other firefighters came to visit. They told stories about Jake growing up in this town, about his family's ranch, about all the times he had helped people. They talked about how he had always been the first to volunteer, the first to help a neighbor in need. Jake's parents were both dead, she learned. His father had died 5 years ago, his mother 2 years after that. He had no siblings. The ranch was all he had, and he ran it alone. The firefighters said he worked harder than any person they knew, trying to keep his family's legacy alive. Sarah also learned about the investigation. The Forest Service was looking into Jake's decision to go after her alone. Some people thought he was a hero. Others thought he had been reckless and endangered himself unnecessarily. There would be a formal inquiry once Jake recovered enough to give his statement. On the third day, Jake woke up. Sarah wasn't there when it happened. She had gone to find coffee and check on Scout. When she returned, a nurse told her that Jake was awake and asking questions. "Can I see him?" Sarah asked. The nurse hesitated. "He's in a lot of pain right now. The doctor is with him, adjusting his medication. Maybe give it an hour?" Sarah waited. When she was finally allowed back into Jake's room, she found him propped up slightly on pillows, positioned so nothing touched his injured back. His eyes were alert but glazed with pain medication. When he saw her, something changed in his expression. "You're alive," he said. His voice was rough. "Thanks to you," Sarah replied. She pulled a chair close to the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got barbecued," Jake said. He tried to smile, but it came out more like a grimace. "They tell me I'll be here for a while." "I'm sorry," Sarah said. "I'm so sorry, Jake. This is all my fault. If I had just listened to you, if I hadn't gone into that restricted area—" "Stop," Jake interrupted. "What's done is done. You made a mistake. We all make mistakes." "My mistake almost got you killed," Sarah said. Tears were running down her face. "Your back, your arms. They said it's going to take months to heal. But I am going to heal," Jake said. "That's what matters." He looked at her carefully. "Are you okay? Really okay?" Sarah nodded. "Some minor burns. Smoke inhalation. Nothing serious. The doctors cleared me 2 days ago." "Good," Jake said. He closed his eyes for a moment. "Scout? He's fine. He's downstairs with a volunteer. They won't let him up here, but I've been checking on him every few hours." "Thank you," Jake said. He was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Your camera equipment?" Sarah almost laughed, but it came out as a sob. "Gone. Everything's gone. My cameras, my truck, the cabin I was renting. All of it burned. Insurance? We'll cover some of it," Sarah said. "But that's not important. None of that matters compared to what you lost." "I didn't lose anything," Jake said. "Jake, you're back. We'll heal," he repeated firmly. "I didn't lose my life. You didn't lose yours. Everything else is just details." Sarah looked at this man lying in a hospital bed with severe burns, telling her that everything was just details. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She did both. Over the next week, a routine developed. Sarah spent most of her time at the hospital. She had contacted her editor in Seattle, explaining what had happened. He had been shocked but supportive. He told her to take whatever time she needed. The story could wait, but Sarah discovered she didn't want to go back to Seattle. Not yet, maybe not ever. Something had changed in her during those 47 minutes under the fire shelter. Something had shifted in her priorities and understanding of what mattered. She found a cheap motel room where she and Scout could stay. The owner, hearing about what happened, gave her a discount. People in the town were kind. They brought her food, offered her clothes, asked if she needed anything. Small-town life was different from the city. Here everyone knew everyone else's business, and everyone knew that Jake Thornton had saved the life of that photographer woman from Seattle. Sarah started learning more about Jake's situation. His ranch was in trouble. The fire had come close but hadn't burned his property, which was lucky. But the drought had destroyed his hay crop, and he had been struggling financially even before the fire. Now, with Jake in the hospital, there was no one to take care of the cattle or maintain the property. Sarah didn't know anything about ranching, but she could learn. She started spending mornings at Jake's ranch, which was being temporarily managed by a neighbor named Tom. Tom was in his 60s, a retired rancher who had known Jake's father. He showed Sarah the basics: how to feed the cattle, how to check water levels, how to fix a fence. "You don't have to do this," Tom said one morning. "This isn't your responsibility." "I know," Sarah said, "but I want to help." Tom looked at her thoughtfully. "Jake's a good man. Best man I know. If he risked his life for you, he must have seen something worth saving." "He would have done it for anyone," Sarah said. "Maybe," Tom agreed, "but he did it for you. That means something." Jake's recovery was slow and painful. The burn unit doctors were cautious about infection. They changed his dressings twice a day, a process that left Jake pale and sweating. Physical therapy started after the first week. They needed to keep his skin from scarring too tightly, keep his range of motion. Every session was agony. Sarah was there for as many of them as the hospital allowed. She held Jake's hand during the worst parts. She distracted him with stories about learning to ranch, about the cattle, about Scout's adventures. She told him funny things that happened at the motel. She talked about anything except the fire. Other visitors came too. The fire chief came to tell Jake that the inquiry had been resolved. Jake had been cleared of any wrongdoing. In fact, the department wanted to give him a commendation for bravery. Jake had just nodded, too tired to react much. Sarah's editor called with news. The story about the fire had gained national attention. The dramatic rescue of a photographer by a volunteer firefighter had captured people's imagination. Several news organizations wanted to interview them both. Sarah had declined. She didn't ask Jake's opinion. She knew he wouldn't want the attention. But then something unexpected happened. The local community decided to hold a fundraiser for Jake's medical bills. The fire department organized it. They set up a donation page online and planned a benefit dinner at the community center. When Sarah heard about it, she made a decision. She went to her bank and transferred money. It was most of her savings, the money she had been keeping for a down payment on a house someday. She donated it anonymously to Jake's fund. It wasn't enough to cover everything, but it would help. The benefit dinner was held 3 weeks after the fire. Jake was still in the hospital, but the community showed up in force. Hundreds of people came. They ate casseroles and pie. They bid on donated items in a silent auction. They shared stories about Jake and his family. Sarah attended but tried to stay in the background. She didn't feel like she belonged. These were Jake's people, his community. She was just an outsider who had caused trouble, but then Tom found her and brought her to the front of the room. The fire chief was speaking, thanking everyone for coming. When he saw Sarah, he called her up to the microphone. "Many of you have heard the story," the chief said, "but I think it's important that you hear it from Sarah herself. Sarah, would you tell us what happened that day?" Sarah hadn't prepared anything to say. She stood at the microphone looking out at all these faces and felt overwhelmed. But then she thought about Jake lying in that hospital bed, about his gray eyes looking at her with determination, about his voice saying those words. "I made a mistake," Sarah began. Her voice was shaky. "I went somewhere I shouldn't have gone. I ignored warnings. I thought I knew better than the people who live here. And because of my mistake, Jake Thornton nearly died." The room was completely silent. "But Jake didn't think about that," Sarah continued. "He didn't think about whether I deserved to be saved." 6 months had passed since the fire. Winter had come to Montana, covering the burned forest in snow. The charred trees looked like black bones against the white landscape, but even there life was returning. Small green shoots pushed through the snow in places where the fire had cleared away old growth. Nature was healing, slowly but surely. Sarah stood at the window of the small cottage on Jake's property, watching the sunrise paint the snow pink and gold. The cottage was cozy now. She had spent weeks fixing it up, learning carpentry and plumbing from Tom and other neighbors. It had become truly hers, filled with her books and her new camera equipment and Scout's toys. Scout. The dog had become as much hers as Jake's now. He split his time between the cottage and the main house, a faithful companion to both of them. Right now he was asleep on the rug, his paws twitching as he dreamed. Sarah had been living on the ranch for half a year. She had learned more in those 6 months than in years of wandering. She knew how to fix a fence, deliver a calf, operate a tractor, and read weather patterns. Her hands were rough and strong. Her body was lean from physical work. She barely recognized herself in the mirror anymore, but she liked what she saw. She had also been working on her photography, but differently now. Instead of chasing dramatic stories in far-off places, she had been documenting the forest's recovery. She had taken hundreds of photos of new growth pushing through ash, of animals returning to the burned areas, of the subtle changes that most people missed. The work was slow and required patience, but it was deeply satisfying. Her editor had published her original photos to great acclaim. The images had won an award. Several magazines had offered her assignments, but Sarah had turned them all down. She wasn't interested in traveling anymore. Everything she wanted to photograph was right here. She had also been documenting something else, though she hadn't shown anyone yet. She had been photographing Jake's recovery, not in an invasive way, but in quiet moments. Jake doing physical therapy, his face tight with determination. Jake working with his hands, relearning tasks that had once been easy. Jake laughing with Scout, the scars on his arms visible but no longer angry and red. The scars. They would always be there. The doctor said Jake had healed remarkably well, better than expected. But the marks of the fire would be with him forever. Wide patches of shiny tight skin across his back and arms. Jake never complained about them. He wore them like a badge, a reminder of what he had survived. Sarah heard a knock at the cottage door. She opened it to find Jake standing there wearing a heavy coat and boots. His breath made clouds in the cold air. "Morning," he said. "Thought you might want to take a drive with me. There's something I want to show you." "What is it?" Sarah asked. "You'll see," Jake said with a small smile. Sarah bundled up and followed Jake to his truck. It was a new truck, bought with the insurance money from the one that had burned. Scout jumped in between them, tail wagging. They drove out of the ranch and onto the highway, heading toward the mountains. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked. "To the forest," Jake said. "To where it happened." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She hadn't been back to that place since the fire. She wasn't sure she wanted to go back. But she trusted Jake. If he wanted to show her something, there must be a reason. They drove for about 30 minutes, then turned onto a Forest Service road. The road had been cleared of debris, but the burned trees pressed close on both sides. Everything was still black and white, ash and snow. Finally, Jake pulled over at what looked like a random spot. "This is it," he said. "This is where we were." They got out of the truck. Sarah looked around, trying to recognize the landscape. It was almost impossible. Everything had changed. The trees that had provided landmarks were gone. The rocks were blackened. Even the shape of the land seemed different, but then she saw them. The large boulders where they had sheltered. They were still there, unmoved by the fire. And behind them, the small depression where they had lain, protected by Jake's body and those thin silver shelters. Sarah walked toward the rocks slowly. Jake followed, with Scout at his heels. When they reached the spot, Sarah stood there for a long moment, remembering. The heat, the sound, the feeling of Jake's hand holding hers in the darkness. "Why did you want to come here?" she asked quietly. Jake pointed to the ground around the rocks. Sarah looked closer and gasped. All around the depression, small green plants were growing. Not just one or two, but dozens of them. Tiny shoots pushing through the ash, bright against the black ground. "This is the first place I've seen new growth," Jake said. "Right here where we survived. It's like the land knows something good happened here, something worth celebrating." Sarah knelt down and touched one of the small plants gently, her eyes filled with tears. "I can't believe it," she whispered. "After everything that burned, life is coming back." "It always does," Jake said. He knelt beside her, moving carefully because his back still got stiff in the cold. "That's what I've learned. Fire destroys, but it also clears the way for new things to grow, sometimes better things than what was there before." They stayed there for a while, looking at the new growth. Scout sniffed around the area, tail wagging. Eventually, Jake stood and offered Sarah his hand to help her up. She took it, and for a moment they just stood there, hand in hand, looking at each other. "I'm glad you stayed," Jake said. "Me too," Sarah replied. On the drive back, Jake told Sarah about his plans for the ranch. The winter had been manageable, but spring would bring new challenges. He needed to rebuild his hay operation. He wanted to try some new grazing techniques he had read about. He talked about his hopes for the future, and Sarah listened, contributing her own ideas. When they reached the ranch, there was a car parked in the driveway. A rental car with a Seattle plate. Sarah's editor, David, got out when he saw them pull up. "Sarah," David called out. "I should have called first, but I was in the area and thought I'd stop by." Sarah introduced David to Jake. The two men shook hands, sizing each other up. David was smooth and professional in his city clothes. Jake was solid and quiet in his ranch gear. They were like people from different worlds. "I wanted to talk to you about an opportunity," David said to Sarah. "Can we chat?" They went into the main house. Jake excused himself to do some work, leaving Sarah and David alone in the living room. David looked around at the simple, comfortable space with curiosity. "So this is where you've been living," he said. "It's very rustic." "I like it," Sarah said simply. David pulled out his laptop and showed Sarah a presentation. A major publisher wanted to do a book about climate change and its effects on wildlife. They wanted Sarah to be the photographer. It would mean traveling to multiple locations over a year. The pay was substantial. It was the kind of opportunity most photographers dreamed of. Sarah looked at the presentation, at the exotic locations and the generous budget. A year ago, she would have jumped at this chance. But now, looking at those glossy images, she felt nothing but disinterest. "I'm going to say no," Sarah said. David looked shocked. "What, Sarah? This is an incredible opportunity. This could make your career." "I already have a career," Sarah said. "I'm working on a different project now. Something more personal." "What project?" Sarah hesitated, then told him. She was documenting the forest's recovery over the course of a year. She was creating a series about resilience and rebirth. She already had hundreds of images. She thought it could be a book, but a different kind of book than what David was proposing. David listened, his expression skeptical. "That's a nice idea, Sarah, but it's not going to pay the bills. Recovery stories don't have the same impact as crisis stories. People want drama, urgency. They want to feel scared and angry. They don't want hope." "Maybe they need hope," Sarah said quietly. "Maybe I need to give them hope." David shook his head. "You're making a mistake. You're letting this place, this man, cloud your judgment. You're a talented photographer, but you're wasting yourself here." "I don't think I'm wasting anything," Sarah said. "I think I'm finally finding what matters." David gathered his things, frustrated. "If you change your mind, call me. But opportunities like this don't come along every day." After David left, Sarah sat alone in the living room, wondering if she had made the right choice. Was she wasting her talent? Was she running away from success by staying here? But when she thought about leaving, about going back to that nomadic life, she felt only sadness. Jake came in from outside, his cheeks red from the cold. "He gone?" "Yeah," Sarah said. "He offered me a job. A big one. I turned it down." Jake sat down across from her. "Why?" "Because I don't want to leave," Sarah said simply. She looked at Jake. "Is that crazy? To turn down a dream job to stay on a ranch in Montana?" "Depends on what your dreams are," Jake said. "Are you staying because of the work? Or are you staying because of something else?" Sarah met his eyes. They had been dancing around this question for months. They worked together every day. They ate meals together. They sat on the porch in the evenings and talked about everything and nothing. But neither of them had acknowledged what was growing between them. "I'm staying because of you," Sarah said. Her heart was pounding.